Welcome to Twin Cam. Eric Tegler with you today, and hey, I think you can tell we're in a garage. To be more specific, we're in a garage in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, and sitting behind me is a really interesting car. This is an American Special. We can explain what an American Special means. It is called a Cheetah. This is a 1964 replica Cheetah Roadster. And the owner of the car is with us today. Gary Breeback is his name. Gary, welcome to Twin Cam.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much for having us and for doing the work that you've done on this beautiful Cheetah. Gary built this himself. We'll get into that a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. But let's explain to our viewers who may not be familiar with the car the background of the Cheetah. This was built originally, I guess, in 1963 and 1964 by a Southern California speed shop owned by a guy by the name of Bill Thomas, right?
That's right.
And what was the motivation for building this car?
Well, Bill Thomas Jr. had raced Corvettes extensively.
Yeah, he was way into Corvette stuff, and he was known for that in Southern California.
He was one of Chevrolet's, General Motors' top tuners in the late 50s and early 60s. And the Corvettes were starting to get it handed to them by the newly announced Cobras.
Right, and GM had also kind of backed off from racing at the same time.
Yes, but they came to Bill Thomas sort of covertly.
That's what I understand. Yeah, they still wanted to be involved, and I know Zora Arcus Duntov had an aborted program, but they still had the GM's performance division, still had that sort of hunger to go racing.
Yes, so they approached Bill Thomas Jr. and they backed him with factory parts, the newest and best equipment that General Motors had at the time.
And most of it was sort of Corvette related, if I recall correctly. So drivetrain and suspension and brakes.
Spindles, a lot of stuff came from Corvettes, yes. The bearing uprights.
And so then, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill sat down with his lead fabricator, Don Edmonds, and they sketched out a chassis, I guess, and then I think Don did the sketch for the body, correct?
That's the way I understand it, yes.
Yep. And what resulted is what you see behind us. However, the first Cheetahs that were built, the first one that was built, I guess, in '63 was an aluminum body car, correct?
Yes.
And it was a coupe, not a roadster like you see here. They then went on to use that as sort of a proof of concept, I guess. My understanding is that that was really built as a GT car, not really as a race car, and as such the chassis wasn't braced sufficiently for racing, and but it was to show GM what Bill Thomas and Don Edmonds could do.
Exactly. Their intention was to try and build over 100 cars to meet the production racing requirements.
Yes, that was the homologation requirements for SCCA in that era, 62, 3, 4. I think it changed for 65-ish, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. That also led to the demise of the program.
Yes, I think they went from, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gary, I think it was 100 prior, and then it had to be like 1,000 cars or something like that. And the chassis underneath is a chromoly space frame chassis, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
That's correct.
And geometry just kind of figured out by Don Edmonds and Bill Thomas, I guess.
The story goes they laid the drivetrain out on the floor of the garage and then sort of drew the frame and all around the drivetrain laid out there. And Don Edmonds evidently used that technique for a lot of his cars, which were pretty successful on the West Coast at that time.
And I think he built some Indy cars as well, or was involved with engineering some Indy cars as well.
That's correct.
Which is fantastic history. I just love that kind of stuff. And I love that kind of crossover between, different projects, street racing, what have you.
Yes.
Eventually the cars got out and got on the racing scene, and I don't know, do you know where they raced first?
Extensively on the West Coast, and some of the first ones came to Daytona for the Continental.
But tell our viewers what the cars were capable of, particularly at a place like Daytona.
Well, in Daytona in 1964, They reached speeds in the 215 mile an hour bracket. One they said went as fast as 218.
And that's amazing. That's on the road course portion of the Daytona circuit, but also on
on
two
high
corners
banks.
using the high banks.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the big joke was the one of the cars, I'm not sure which one, blew its own doors off because the aerodynamics weren't that good on the cars and built pressure inside the body and literally forced the doors off the car.
Yeah, if you think about the exterior mold line of this body and air pressure getting underneath it and actually flexing the body and making those doors kind of pop out. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I can certainly see the possibility of that happening. The cars, went on from there to other racing success. But for our viewers who may be saying, this thing, 218, how could it possibly do that? Give them some insight on why it might be able to do that.
Well, the cars they took to Daytona had a lot of lightweight parts on them from General Motors, aluminum and maybe even magnesium rear ends. The one car that they think did 218 had an aluminum engine, aluminum heads, Weber carburetors. They were running like 292 gears. So they were, set up with like 520 horsepower small blocks.
Right, and with all the lightweight gear, you're probably talking about a car that weighed in the region of 1,500 pounds or so.
Yes, it was somewhere in that 15 to 16.
15 to 16. So you put 15 to 1,600 pounds together with 500 odd horsepower, and you can go a long way with that.
Yes.
Particularly with something low as this, with a fairly slippery profile, and that's how that happened. The car is, the wheelbase is something that everybody notes because it's pretty small. It's like 90 inches, isn't it?
Exactly. It's 90-inch wheelbase, so with that much horsepower and all, it's a lot like an altered drag car. It's a handful.
And in fact, one or two of these were raced as drag racing cars.
Yes.
At least one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Also, tell the viewers about the implications for the drivetrain layout of 90 inches of wheelbase.
Well, to get the engine back as far as possible for the weight distribution, they don't use a drive shaft at all. The engine and transmission are connected directly to the Corvette rear end.
So it's just a output shaft from the transmission to a U-joint, right back to the differential.
That's correct. And so you're setting with your legs up underneath the headers and your back's right against the half shafts of the Corvette rear end.
Yeah, it's really, you really are, and we'll get a chance to feel, and Gary will get a chance to show us, you're really part of the machine, I would think. That's got to impart a great feeling of being an experienced part of the whole driving, visceral feeling of that. It's got to be fantastic.
Oh, it's you can tell the horsepower, the weight is phenomenal. I mean, the car is just so light, so quick.
And as the viewers will see when we show them, the engine is mounted significantly behind not only the end of the body here, but behind that front axle. It really is, when you pop that clamshell hood and see it, impressive to look at.
It's almost a true mid-engine, actually.
I think they said the weight distribution was a little bit more on the rear than actually on the front.
Yes, I'm not sure what the original ones were exactly. Mine, I didn't figure out the percentages, but it's about 300 pounds heavier in the rear end. But I also have the fuel cell mounted in the back.
Gotcha.
The original ones mounted the fuel cells in the pods alongside the doors, under the doors.
Okay.
So that helped the weight distribution.
Not so good for safety, though.
No.
Not so much. The cars went on to be raced for the 64 season and I guess into the 1965 season. And they had mixed success. There were a couple of wins, I think, but the cars simply did not have enough development to actually go for outright wins. And I don't think they ever raced against the Cobra head-to-head. They raced in different classes, I think.
Yeah, they actually had to run into modified classes against much more developed race cars like Lolas and stuff like that. And they did fairly well. The Cro-Sal Special won 11 races, and it was probably the most successful of the Cheetahs, but they weren't major races. I mean, a lot of them were
Regional SCCA
races,
type
stuff
meets,
like that.
yeah.
Its biggest win was the one at Road America, or Elkhart Lake, I think, in '64, I believe it was.
So ultimately, I think they say there were something around 20 of these original cars built.
Well, according to who you talk to, they say between 11 and 15, 20, somewhere in that amount. There were like 11 or so complete cars built, but they had complete frames already built. And some of those were, I think, used later to finish cars. So it's kind of hard to pin
It's
it down.
nebulous, yeah, as to how many were actually built. But they did get out there and they did race, and your car is sort of replicating or a nod to a car that a gentleman had raced at Daytona. But I can't remember the name.
Ralph Salyer.
Ralph Salyer.
Yeah, his mechanic was Gene Crow, and hence that's
Cro-Sal.
Cro-Sal,
Yes.
exactly. But Gene must have been a pretty sharp guy, and he decided the best way to help Ralph out would be to take the roof off.
And in this case, I guess you decided to go that route because A, it gets rid of some of that heat problem, and B, it just makes it more of a driving experience.
I just love the Roadster look.
Sure,
I
there
think
is that too.
You know, I just think that Roadster is the slickest looking Cheetah of the whole group.
And that's a good point for us to jump off and talk about why you have this car and what drew you to, you know, the, I would call it not easy or simple process of kind of making your own Cheetah with help from some existing bits and pieces that were out there. What about it fascinated you?
Well, I've got a love for sports cars. I've always been involved in racing since I was a teenager, and recently I had some European sports cars and stuff, which my friends sort of don't
Cotton to.
let's say. And so I wanted to build something with some American grunt that they could relate to and possibly have some fun with at vintage events. And I raced slot cars when I was a kid, and my favorite slot car was the Cheetah.
And in fact, I think there's a little known fact or a curious fact about it. You know, Bill Thomas built whatever the number is of these cars in the original run, and then there were continuation cars later on. But the most Cheetahs that were ever sold were slot cars and matchbox cars and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people remember them and love them because of the beauty of the bodies. The lines are so fluid, sort of a cross between a Jag and a Corvette.
There's definitely some E-type, D-type in the front end, and definitely Corvette with a cam tail at the rear end.
Right.
Again, we'll see that as we talk about this. But so that look, that aesthetic, combined with a desire to build something American, kind of got you.
And I knew that if I built a decent engine in something this lightweight, that it would impress a few people, a few of my muscle car friends.
You bet. I think originally the cars came with a small block, like a 327 displacement. Is that right?
Yes, the original ones for the street were 327s with Rochester fuel injection, and the race version they bored and stroked out to 377 cubic inches, and they used the Bill Thomas dual meter fuel injection.
Right. And what are you running in this currently?
Well, in order to keep the costs down, I went with the tried and true 350 Chevrolet, bored and stroked to a 383, and I'm using Edelbrock dual quad AFB type carburetors.
Any idea what sort of power output from that configuration?
Yes, I used a build plan from a well-known engine builder, and the engine should be making somewhere around 475 horsepower.
which is plenty in this car. Absolutely, no doubt about it. What's most impressive about the whole thing here is not just the car itself, but that Gary did most of the work, if not all, in this shop that we're sitting in right here. And it's a neat little space, but it's not the most sophisticated of places. What makes it sophisticated is Gary's talent in getting this done. Tell us how you put this car together.
Well, when I decided what I was going to do for the project, the first thing I had to do was find a body. And I expected to be able to find one because there were a lot of replicas and kit cars out there. You know?
And just so we're clear, it is a fiberglass body.
And I found a body on eBay, and I purchased it, not knowing at the time that I was purchasing it from BTM of Tempe, Arizona, who are the ones that were building the continuation cheetahs.
Right, and there are a couple of other body providers out there, but this is really spiritually and dimensionally probably the most faithful body.
Yes, this body, the molds for this body were taken off of an original cheetah that BTM had in their shop, and that's what they used to build the continuation cars. So this is a fairly faithful replica of what the originals looked like.
So you started off by hitting eBay, getting yourself a body. Where'd it go from there?
Well, then the research started. And I built drag cars as a kid. And with the drag cars, you just take any old frame and throw some suspension parts and a big engine in it.
Make sure it's straight.
And
Yeah, right.
go fast.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit different when you want to turn corners and stuff with the
Yeah.
car. So I did a lot of research on the suspension and how to build the frames and stuff. And it probably took 6 months of research before I even bent the first piece of tubing.
Were there available plans for the chassis for these?
At the time I started my research, I could not find anything. What I used for most of my resources was an article from Hot Rod Magazine from 1964, in which they did an article on the prototype for the first Cheetah. And it gave a lot of good dimensions and photographs of the original car. And I actually scaled off of some of the photographs and used their dimensions to design a frame in my basement on a little drafting table. So that's how I came up with my frame, which it fairly is close to original.
Well, that's hugely impressive. I mean, you just toss that off like it's nothing. But
Well,
honestly, that is a very admirable intellectual feat to be able to pull off with very little in the way of guidance and resources.
after I designed my frame, I found a couple other drawings online, but they were actually just almost identical to my drawings. And so I just went ahead with the ones that I designed, and I started from there.
And you did, I guess, the mandrel drawing or bending, and worked with the chromoly 4130 that you obtained.
Right. I bought all the tubing and stuff from local suppliers. I'd already had a pipe bender, but it was an antique. And right here on this floor, about where you're sitting, I started bending the main frame rails, and once I got the one where I wanted it, I drew on the floor with soapstone.
Make a template for...
Made the second one match the first one, and then over here behind me there's a junior I-beam table that I built to use as a jig table.
So you actually built your own tooling to go along with it.
You had to.
Yeah.
You had to take on the project like that.
So from there to doing the weld, did you do the welding on it?
Oh yes, all the welding.
So it's all like, think TIG welding probably?
Yes.
Yeah, it's all TIG.
Right.
And again, hugely impressive, the attention to detail, the concentration that it takes. When our viewers will, put up a couple of pictures of some of the chassis, there's a lot of welding there, because there's a lot of cut angles And a lot of junctions that you have to
Exactly.
do well.
They have to be coped, and a lot of it's coped by hand. It takes a lot of time.
So this really is a piece of craftsmanship. It's not just a pretty car that you can go have fun with on a Sunday or on a Saturday at a race. This is actually a piece of craftsmanship, which is, again, very impressive. So then I guess it was a matter of perhaps making sure your suspension was correctly located and...
Well, actually, I learned this in my research, that you start from the wheels and tires and build the car in.
Aha. So you really use that suspension as a starting point.
I had to plan on the wheels and tires that I was going to use first, and then you had to get the hubs and spindles and figure the A-arms and all that kind of stuff before you even thought about the frame, because once you decide all that, that's going to determine where your pickup points are at on your frame.
Exactly.
And then you design the frame for those pickup points. The engine is actually offset about 1.5 inches to the passenger side, so that it lines up directly to the rear end.
Sure.
And you had to allow on the motor mounts, so everything's solid, motor mounts, transmission mount, rear end mount, you had to allow some adjustability in those things in order to be able to get everything to line up properly. So when I built the mounts for all those pieces, I built them with some extra clearance, figuring on using shims for everything in order to shim it and get everything lined up correctly.
For some of the other basics, what have we gone with in terms of a transmission here?
I wanted to be true to the original, so I'm using an M22 Muncie.
And that's a 4-speed.
That's a 4-speed from, like the old Corvette Z06.
Sure. And your rear end?
The rear end is a 60 through to 68 type Corvette center section with Corvette half shafts and Corvette bearing uprights.
So you really do have a pretty, I'm sure it'll feel like a Cheetah would have felt. I'll put it that way.
Yes, I tried to do that throughout the project. The only place I really varied a little bit was on the frame. I added extra stiffeners in the frame and I'll try and stiffen it up.
Sure.
Because that was one of the problems with the original cars. I think they actually used stock type motor mounts on the front of the engines on those cars. I went to a motor plate like a sprint car to help stiffen it up again.
And in fact, some people have actually compared these to sprint cars in some ways in the way that they drive.
Yes, Don Edmonds, that was one of his big things, was building sprint cars there on the West Coast.
So that
there's a lot of the
influence, that's
Exactly.
that's a great a little cultural thing that kind of creeps into something like this, which I find fascinating. Control arms are different.
The front suspension are all hand-built Chrome Moly A-arms.
Wow.
I elected to use 68 Camaro spindles. The originals used heavy, some kind of 63 or 64 Chevrolet heavy-duty spindle. But I couldn't get the geometry to work out the way I wanted it to, and so I found that the Camaro spindles worked out real well.
That's great.
Yes, it has coilover shocks all the way around on all 4 corners, but it's hand-built A-arms in the front. The rear suspension is coilover shock with the Corvette half shaft acting as the upper control arm.
Ah, I see. Okay.
And then I've got a hand-built Moly lower control arm that takes the place of the Corvette type arm. And it does retain the Corvette type trailing arms, but I did not use the stock Corvette trailing arms because they didn't use them in the original Cheetahs. They built the trailing arms out of Moly tubing
So
also.
they just fabricated their own.
And so I followed suit and did the same thing.
Well, that's one of the things, again, that's so interesting about this is that you don't seem to have been inclined to, and to keep with the spirit of the car, you didn't take many shortcuts.
Didn't think you had to. I thought the car was pretty awesome the way it was, and I wanted to replicate that so people could see it.
That's fantastic. And so what was the timeline for the process? How long did it take you from, making that original drawing?
Well, I started in 2009, and I just finished here in 2016 in June.
Yeah,
So it's been
we're looking at about a 7-year
build.
process. And that is one of the things I think that many restorers, perhaps that's their best quality, the stick-to-itiveness.
Oh, there were many times I was thinking to myself, what in the world have I got myself into?
It's a very common and very understandable story where you're just probably ready to pull your hair out.
There were a lot of challenges, believe me, a lot of challenges. And probably the biggest was getting the foot pedals and all in that footwell because it's so narrow.
Once you had overcome those challenges to the extent that you did, got the thing on the road, got it to where it is right now, what's your level of satisfaction with it? Personally, if I were you, I'd be just looking at it, I'd be very satisfied.
It went, I don't know. It met my highest expectations. I couldn't be happier with the way it turned out.
And to me, it's interesting, not only, you, Gary, and folks like you have the vision, imagination, and talent to do this and combine the ingenuity to do it in a basic garage like this, but you get to see the fruits of your physical and intellectual labors move, go down the road. You get to feel them, you get to smell them. That must be very satisfying.
It's very satisfying, and the reaction of people and all at the car shows and stuff that I've been to has really made the whole project worthwhile.
Well, that's Twin Cam for today. I hope you got an enjoyable taste of this fast kitty, the Cheetah, and our thanks to Gary Breeback for letting us be around it and for building such a damn beautiful car, Gary.
Well, thank you very much.
Well done, sir.